Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm Rav, the Senior Fundraising Coordinator. I'd like to acknowledge that our work takes place on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. It's thanks to supporters like you that in only 10 months since launching BC Policy Solutions, we've achieved so much. We're excited to keep building our community of supporters. So please help us spread the word. Tell your family, friends, and colleagues about us. Additionally, if you'd like to make a donation to support our work, there'll be a link in the chat. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A function. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can during the Q&A portion. Thank you so much. With that, I'll hand it over to Iglika.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar today. My name is Iglika Ivanova, and I am one of the two co-executive directors of BC Policy Solutions. BC Policy Solutions is a new independent research institute in this province. As Rav mentioned, we've been around for 10 months, but it is an institute launched by a group of people with decades of experience in public policy analysis and advocacy in our province. Our staff and board have deep experience. We develop and promote rigorous research to bring clarity to the pressing challenges of our time. And we offer bold solutions to improve life for workers, families, and communities across the province. Our work is grounded in principles of economic, social, racial, and environmental justice, and done collaboratively with organizations and advocates working towards these same goals of equity and justice in the BC. I invite you all to visit our website, bcpolicy.ca, and look at our publications. You can also find recordings of previous webinars if you have missed some in our fall webinar series. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today's webinar on this year's living wage calculations in BC. I'm thrilled that we're joined today by Anastasia French, the Managing Director of Living Wage BC. Anastasia is a strategic thinker and campaign organizer who successfully engages workers, community organizations, government, and businesses around the importance of paying a living wage. And I have partnered on calculating the living wage in communities across BC for 5 years now. And we're also both board members of the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition. It's always a pleasure to work with her in any capacity, including to give presentations with her. So with that, I will pass it on to Anna.
Thanks very much, Iglika. What kind words. I'll give a second for the slides to load. So hello, everyone. Me and Iglika will do a bit of a tag team today. I'll talk through a little bit kind of what a living wage is, and then Iglika will go into this year's living wage report and all of the technicalities in it. And then I'll end by talking through about becoming a living wage employer and what that means and how to do it. And then we'll end on a Q&A where if you've got any questions that are coming up with anything that we've shared, feel free to add it to the Q&A and then we'll try and answer it at the end. These slides will also be shared, I've been told, as will this recording. So if there's something you miss or you want to watch again, don't worry, you will have an opportunity to do that. So starting off, for those who don't know, the living wage is the hourly amount that a worker needs to earn in order to support themselves and their family in their community. The living wage covers basic needs like food, clothing, shelter, and transportation, and it allows the workers the ability to participate in community life. It's supposed to represent a basic but decent budget and how much you need in order to get by. It enables workers to avoid falling into debt or chronic financial stress and affords a basic level of economic security, but without many of the comforts or extras that we take for granted. And Iglika will go into a bit more detail later on about kind of what that means and what is included in the living wage and what's not. But the reason I'm really passionate about living wage, and I know Iglika is too, is that it takes a really complicated issue like poverty and it turns it into something that we can all do something about. As consumers, we can make sure that we spend our money in living wage businesses. As employers, we can make sure that we pay our workers and our contractors a living wage. and it can make an enormous difference on the lives of low-wage workers. It helps make employers part of the solution. It's a positive focus campaign on how we can actually improve and lift people out of poverty. It helps change how we value public services, and Iglika will go into a bit more detail later about the role that investments in childcare, for example, are having in both helping parents be able to get back to work and put their kids in childcare and affordably, and also help lower the living wage, which actually then makes it easier for employers to pay the living wage. It helps boost the local economy. Over 2,000 workers last year got a pay increase because their employer committed to bring them up to the living wage. And what that means is for those 2,000 workers is they've got more money that they can spend in local businesses, strengthening the local economy. We know it's a really difficult time right now for many small businesses, but if we can make sure that workers have more money that they can spend, that will help strengthen the local economy, benefiting all of us. It helps shift the way that employers and all of us view low-wage workers. That was a trend that we began to see during the pandemic. When the world shut down, it was low-wage workers who were going into work, risking their lives to keep us safe, keep us fed, and keep places clean. It's vital that workers who are doing this are paid at least a wage that means that they can pay for rent and pay for food for themselves. And as I said, it guarantees a pay increase for thousands of workers across British Columbia. And last year, over 2,000 workers received a pay increase because their certified living wage employer committed to pay them a living wage. I'm sure there are thousands more workers who work for employers who use living wage as a benchmark. They just may not certify with us. So it may not be, maybe even more than that in terms of how to quantify that as an impact for workers in BC. And for this man, it means that he can spend more time with his family because he's not having to work two full-time jobs. And more time with his family is more time in the local community and more time making BC a better place for all of us to live. But unfortunately, despite that, 1 in 3 workers in British Columbia don't currently earn a living wage. And when we did some research and we drilled down into who those workers were, it really exposed a lot of the gender and racial pay gaps or gender and racial gaps that we already know exist. Women are much less likely to earn a living wage than men. Racialized workers are much less likely to earn a living wage than white workers. And when you intersect those, we found out that half of all racialized women in Metro Vancouver don't earn a living wage. I talk about living wage every day of the year, and when Iglika discovered those stats, I was truly shocked, and I still remain shocked today. It's if we want to close gender and racial pay gaps, that starts by making sure that we can ensure that all workers in BC can earn a living wage. Because right now, in a province as beautiful as British Columbia, it is a disgrace that 1 in 3 workers don't actually earn enough in order to be able to get by. And I will hand over to Iglika, who will talk through this year's living wage report.
Thank you, Anastasia, for giving us that introduction. Yeah, it's my turn now to talk you through some of the details of the calculation of what we found, how it's different from last year, and what it means for public policy and for advocacy. For those who haven't heard me present about the living wage before, I have been doing this work as the lead economist working on the calculations since 2011. So this is my 15th year calculating the living wage, and it has been very exciting to see this project grow. We have now 27 communities across the province that have calculated their living wage for 2025 and released it last week. This is the most communities we've ever had in the province, so the numbers keep growing, and it's very exciting to see that. Every one of those calculations is done with a community partner in that community. You know, the BC Policy Solutions is the community partner for Metro Vancouver, but every other community has a local community partner that helps us come up with the estimate of expenses locally and collects local cost of living. There is a wide variation across the province, as you may imagine, in the living wage. That's because cost of rent and cost of transportation and food vary quite a bit across the province. So the living wage in BC this year range from a low of $21.55 in Grand Forks to a high of $29.60 in Whistler. And for reference, the minimum wage is currently $17.85. So you can see that it is lower than the living wage anywhere in this province, and not just a dollar or two lower, it's significantly lower than the living wage in most places. The next slide, you can see a map of the living wage rates in different communities and see kind of what coverage we have with the calculation. The highest living wages are seen in the Sea to Sky corridor. Whistler and Squamish had the two highest, followed by Metro Vancouver. The lowest living wages, as we mentioned, Grand Forks, also Port Alberni on Vancouver Island, and Trail in the eastern part of the province. They have the lowest, kind of the three lowest living wages, but even there, again, quite a bit higher than the minimum wage. If your community is not on this map, you can get in touch with Anastasia and Living Wage BC to become a community partner perhaps for next year. So we can grow the number of communities where we know what a worker needs to earn to have a decent life. Now, how is the living wage calculated? The living wage formula, if you like, is such that the income from expenses is added to the income from government benefits, so things like child benefits or the climate action tax credit, which got cut mid-year. And then we subtract all the federal and provincial taxes that are mandatory, including employment insurance and Canada Pension Plan premiums, so that after tax, our worker can cover the actual cost of our household expenses. So this is to reflect the actual situation that people face on the ground. We all take advantage of government benefits that we're eligible for, and we all have to pay taxes for the services that we use, and we have to pay our bills with after-tax dollars. So this is the calculation. It was developed in BC in 2008. The first living wage calculation was developed, and it was a very, rigorous process led by First Call and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, BC office, that involved engaging with academic experts, social policy experts, and workers and employers across the province to validate the methodology and to make sure that we've done a good job capturing what it truly costs to live in this province. And then we regularly do methodology reviews to make sure that our calculation continues to reflect the actual situation that workers are facing across the province. So, to estimate the household expenses or the cost of living, we look at 9 different categories of expenses. The basics: food, clothing, shelter, transportation, phone and internet, childcare, adult education, and then we also have estimates for extended healthcare, so healthcare services that are not covered by our healthcare plan, things like dental, which is since this year has been covered for low-income workers by the Canadian Dental Care Plan, but eyeglasses and with prescriptions and a lot of mental health services are still not covered. And other expenses is a small amount, is the amount for participating in fully participating in society, because the living wage is a higher bar than just poverty. We're not interested in trying to re-estimate the poverty line. Statistics Canada already tries to do that with the market basket measure. What we're doing is trying to come up with a living wage calculation that allows someone to live with dignity and to be able to participate in their community. Because unfortunately, a lot of the poverty lines that we estimate do not allow for much of participation in community. So for living wage employers that we certify, and we'll talk about that later on, but employer benefits, some employer benefits can go towards reducing the living wage that has to be paid in monetary terms, because our calculation is based on assuming only the mandatory requirements for paid time off. So we're assuming that the employer does not provide a dental or healthcare coverage. The employer does not provide paid sick leave beyond the statutory minimum of 5 days, and vacation beyond the 2 weeks required. So if the employer does provide that, that reduces some of the costs for families associated with those. And so it can reduce the living wage the employer has to actually pay in order to still overall, with the package of the full compensation package of benefits plus wage, reach the living wage numbers. Now, the important thing about the living wage is that to estimate each of those categories of expenses, we want to use current and local cost of living. So we don't do it province-wide, we do it community by community. And we have to update it regularly because we know that cost of food, cost of shelter, a lot of these costs are increasing every year, often faster than general inflation. So, and that they vary a lot across communities. We see, for example, communities like big urban centers like Metro Vancouver and Greater Victoria have high housing costs, but also resort communities like Whistler, Revelstoke also have very high rental costs. So that change a lot every year. Now, what is not included in the living wage? It's very important to understand that while this is a higher standard than poverty, it is still a very modest budget that this wage is based on. We do not include any provisions for paying student loans, for paying credit card debt, or any other kind of loans. We do not include anything additional for savings for retirement, anything above the Canada Pension Plan mandatory contributions, or for saving for children's higher education. We do not include, of course, uh, owning a home that is out of reach of the living wage family in every community. We do not include cost of caring for a disabled, seriously ill, or an elderly family member, which is a cost that many people do face. We only include minimal spending on recreation, entertainment, and holidays as part of the participation expenses. And we don't have a substantial buffer for emergency or other unexpected events. So if, for example, your car breaks down or you need a new one, that's not something that the living wage provides for. What about the family type? So this year, we have expanded the living wage family model beyond the two-parent, two-child family type that was used for calculating the living wage from 2008 to last year in British Columbia. We are using 3 different household types: a single adult, a single parent with 1 child, and a family of 4 with 2 parents and 2 children. And then taking a weighted average, weighted by the population of adults in each of these family types in BC to come to the official living wage for each community. This is more reflective of the needs of different family types, which government policies can be quite different in the way that they support different family types. Alberta and Ontario living wage networks both use these weighted average family type living wage calculation and have done so since 2021. So now we are, doing something that is in line with what's done elsewhere in Canada, and our numbers are more comparable, more directly comparable with the numbers you see from Ontario and Alberta. If you're curious, the actual numbers for the 3 family types in Metro Vancouver are here on the slide. You can see there isn't a very large discrepancy between the different family types. The family of 4 has the highest living wage of the 3, and the single adult has the lowest. And then the weighted average actually ends up being exactly equivalent to the single parent, 1 child living wage. This is just how the numbers work out in this particular case. It is not the case everywhere in the province. We did find that in communities where transit is poor, the single person has the highest wage required to meet their needs because they need to actually be able to own a car, and owning a car is quite expensive. So in the Metro Vancouver calculation and the calculations for larger cities in the province that have public transit networks, we assume that the single adult does not own a car and only uses public transportation. But in other communities, in more rural communities and smaller communities where transit is non-existent or completely inadequate, then they do need to own a car, and that makes the single person wage quite a bit higher. Usually the difference is like $2, $3 by owning a car and not owning a car. Now, in communities where the living wage is low, in other words, where the cost of living are low, the wage needed for a single parent is the lowest because they receive more in government support. And again, that varies. So in some places in the province, the single parent living wage is higher. In others, it's lower. So it really varies. And it did seem like taking the weighted average does a better, captures better the needs of all family types and how government supports change over time. This is a table from the report, and it shows the monthly household expenses for each household type that go into this year's Metro Vancouver living wage calculation. You know, it's a lot of numbers, so if you are interested in exactly what number we use for each, I recommend that you do look to the report and go through the numbers there in more detail. I wanted to show you this just to point out that the highest two expenses for every household are shelter and food, and often shelter is significantly higher than food. You know, the living wage families are spending a very big chunk of their income on rent, just like many actual renters are in our province. And then the third highest expense for the family of four is the out-of-pocket childcare costs. For the single parent that receives a significant amount of subsidies from the BC Affordable Childcare Benefit, so their out-of-pocket childcare costs are quite low. For them, the third highest expense is transportation. Now, why are we seeing the increase this year? The living wage for Metro Vancouver is $27.85, and that's 3% higher than last year's living wage of $27.05. So why has it grown by 3%? Shelter is the biggest driver, of course, as you saw in the table on the last slide. Shelter is the largest cost for families. And so shelter continues to increase. Why? Because demand for rental housing continues to outpace supply. Even though we have seen some moderation, even though asking rents have fallen from their previous stratospheric highs, we still have very low vacancy rates, and we still have essentially a demand for rental exceeding supply. The region continues to have the highest average asking rents in the country. So even though we've seen declines, and a lot of people, fixate on those reports that come out of rental.ca or all the private rental platforms, it's interesting that official data from Statistics Canada and CMHC also shows the same trends. But I think we need to look at the actual numbers of rents that they point to and remember that they are very, very high. They remain, out of line with with the actual incomes people earn, the paychecks they get, and they are the highest in the country. We have higher asking rents than Toronto. Now, the monthly shelter costs for the living wage household, you see the numbers here for the increases in the different household types. They're different just because we still benchmark against TMHC data, and the numbers are based on the numbers they produce. They don't not all family types, not all units go up by the same amount. For food, this is another big one. It is the second largest expense for the Metro Vancouver living wage household, regardless of the household type. And it has been one of the fastest growing in the last 5 years. This year, the prices of food purchased from stores have increased by 3.6% in the Metro Vancouver calculation. And we are seeing, again, as I mentioned, higher increases year to year than the general CPI. That is reflected by food banks that have become a lifeline for thousands of working people and the demand that food banks are dealing with. Food insecurity is a growing problem in our province. It is not just a social problem, it is a public health emergency. The food insecurity has lasting impacts on physical and mental well-being and on health, and needs to be urgently addressed. The other, kind of thought-provoking or concerning fact that I think a lot of people don't realize is that a quarter of food bank users in BC have income from employment. So a quarter of food bank users actually have a job, but they still need to go to the food bank to make ends meet at the end of the month. So that is shocking. It is a huge increase compared to 10 years ago, where we had rates of maybe 10 or 12%. So like doubling of the share of people who actually have jobs who need the food bank. And that's what demonstrates that living wages are a really crucial part of the puzzle, that wages are a big part of the puzzle. Now, childcare. For our living wage family, childcare costs are increasing rapidly. That is because we're looking at out-of-pocket childcare costs after the BC Affordable Childcare Benefit. For those of you who don't have young children and are not using this benefit, the BC Affordable Childcare Benefit is a benefit or a subsidy for childcare costs that is paid directly to the provider. So it is income tested, the parents apply, and if they get approved, the money is paid directly to the provider so that the family has to pay less out of pocket every month for their fees. So that is why we look at the childcare costs, not just at the fees, but at the fees net of that affordable childcare benefit. The affordable childcare benefit was introduced in 2018, and the amounts were set then. Neither the income thresholds nor the benefit amounts have been changed since 2018. It is not indexed to inflation. It's just left to have inflation erode its value over time. So we're seeing the living wage family of four, and we're seeing that erosion happen. They're eligible for much less benefits, and so their out-of-pocket childcare costs are increasing. I do want to point out for people, again, maybe who don't have children in childcare, that we have seen good, impressive improvements in affordability. Um, we have seen sustained investment provincially and federally in childcare, and the fees that we're using now for the Metro Vancouver living wage calculations, the fees that many parents are facing in licensed childcare, are about half of what they were before these government investments, half of what they were in 2017. Of course, nobody who had young children in 2017 is also having young children now to notice that they're paying less. But it is, having done this calculation year over year for 15 years, it is something that is a big testament to the power of government policy to reduce costs. And we should remember and kind of draw attention to it and know about it. So costs have gone down, but unfortunately, they are the highest in Canada at the moment. That in other provinces, there has been more efforts put towards affordability and lower childcare costs as a result. So even we have seen a lot of progress, impressive, tremendous, great progress since 2017, but other provinces have seen even more. And the job is not done. We need to continue working on childcare affordability. And of course, there's not licensed places for everyone, and many parents are forced to choose between using unlicensed care or working fewer hours or not working at all. Now, we've already started to talk a little bit about that, but I wanted to spend a few minutes to talk a little more explicitly about the role of government and government benefits in reducing the living wage and in improving our standards of living. This is a slide that shows you the impact in living wage terms of the various government benefits that our families or households would be eligible for. You can see that the Canada Child Benefit has the largest value for the living wage and for families. In Metro Vancouver, it lowers the living wage by $2.20. So if there was no Canada Child Benefit, we would have a living wage of $30.05. The second in value is the BC Childcare Fee Reduction Initiative. So that's one of the policies or investments in childcare affordability that reduces fees for everyone. It's almost equal to the Canada Child Benefit in value, and obviously higher value for the families with children. One that is worth pointing out is the Canadian Dental Care Plan. This summer, the Canadian Dental Care Plan became available to low income and modest income adults without disabilities, working age adults without disabilities. Previously, the coverage was only available for children, for seniors, and adults with disabilities. So the expansion of the Canadian Dental Care Plan to all adults lowers the living wage by 40 cents this year in Metro Vancouver. And this is with the dental coverage being available only for half year. So next year you will see a bigger impact of the Canadian Dental Care Plan. The other one, I guess, that I should mention is the BC Renters Tax Credit, the $400 a month tax credit for low and middle income families. It is very little. You already see it from the amount of benefit, but it lowers the living wage by 20 cents. So not a very large benefit and not what renters need. I think renters need a lot more support than that, than $400 a year. And the other one I wanted to draw your attention to is the change in the budget this year was the BC Rental Assistance Program. It is a rental subsidy for families with children who are not on social assistance. So working families with children. The income threshold was increased as of April 1st from 40,000 to 60,000. So at 40,000, was below what a minimum wage worker would earn essentially. But at 60,000, it is now available to the single parent at the living wage of Metro Vancouver. And it is a very significant government benefit. The living wage family in Metro Vancouver, the single parent family, it lowers their living wage by $2.64. So a huge benefit for single parents. Obviously, the $60,000 income cutoff, that does not change with family size, means that two-parent families essentially don't qualify. But for single parents with children, this is a very significant improvement this year. Let me make. Yes, so all told, we're looking at a living wage in Metro Vancouver that is $10 higher than the minimum wage. You can see that over the entire period of time we have calculated the living wage. The living wage has always been higher, but the gap declined quite significantly between 2017 and 2020 when there was both very high increases in the minimum wage and also significant government policy changes that reduce costs for people, like the elimination of MSP premiums and investments in childcare. However, since 2023, you can see what has happened. The gap between the living wage and the minimum wage has grown significantly. And looking at the actual costs people face, we can see that annual increases to inflation is just not going to get us there. We need more substantial increases in the minimum wage. So it is $10 short per hour of a living wage for Metro Vancouver, where the majority of workers live. It is time for the BC government to show leadership and to close the gap between the living wage and the minimum wage. how, we need action from both sides. We need to lift wages and improve workers' rights and benefits. We also need to reduce cost of living. So we need sustained investment in housing affordability, an affordable food strategy, and a substantial investment in transit. Because if we have more transit available and fewer people need to own cars, this is a huge improvement in affordability. And it's also a huge improvement for climate and for livability of our cities. Oh, and the government should become a living wage employer. Yeah. The government should not be contributing to working poverty by paying its own workers and contractors less than the living wage. What you can do if you're inspired to take action, do go on our website, find your community fact sheet and share it widely. Start conversations with your coworkers, with your family, with your neighbors about the importance of living wages for workers, their families, and their communities, and about the big gap between the living wage and the minimum wage. And advocate for sustained action by governments to close the gap. An easy way to do that is to go to our website, municipality.ca/living wage slash #take dash action, and email the living wage report to Premier David Eby and your local MLA, demanding that they take urgent action to close the gap between the minimum and the living wage. And with that, I will pass it to Anastasia to walk you through the role of employers.
Thank you, Iglika. Iglika has really articulated well the role that government can play in ensuring that all workers can earn a living wage. But this is a call of action, not just to government, but also to employers. And we have over 450 living wage employers across BC who have stepped up and who have made that commitment. And they vary from small businesses to nonprofits to municipalities like the City of Burnaby, City of New West, City of North Vancouver, who have all made that commitment. YVR Airport became the first living wage airport in Canada. Modo, Van City Credit Union, Lafarge Concrete, there are lots of brand name organizations that you've heard of who have stepped up and made that commitment. And paying a living wage, it makes an enormous difference and positive impact on workers, communities, and businesses across BC. I think we can all understand why paying a living wage is good for workers. It helps offer independence and peace of mind. Workers aren't stressed about how they're going to make rent or afford food for their families and for themselves. They feel valued and appreciated for the work that they do. And if they're only having to work one job rather than multiple jobs, then that means that that's time that they're spending with their families and in the local community and spending money in local businesses rather than having to take on that second or that third job. But it's also good for organizations. And so there are 450 living wage employers. They do it not just because they know it's the right thing to do, but because they found real business benefits from doing so. So 98% of our living wage employers last year reported benefits from being part of the program. It's helped organizations live their values, help set an example for others. It's also been good publicity, helping employers stand out from their competitors, improving recruitment, improving morale, and lowering staff turnover. And one reason that I'm hearing increasingly from employers is one thing that they like about being a living wage employer is that they can help transparently set wages. They can tell their staff the reason you are earning this amount is because an independent organization have calculated how much it costs to live. And only 2% of employers have found no benefit from being part of the program, which I think is a really shining example of the impact and the positive impact that paying a living wage can have. And finally, it's good for local communities. There's a ripple effect through local supply chains as living wage employers choose to do business with other living wage employers. Unfortunately, we also know that communities often pay the price for working poverty. Working poverty often has enormous fiscal implications for social programs, healthcare costs, education, employment, rising cost of people having to visit food banks, and all of these things are because people just don't have enough money. So if we can help lift more people out of poverty, then we can help lower those costs too. And the final thing is that Goldman Sachs have found that when low-wage workers receive a pay increase, they're actually far more likely to spend that money and spend that money locally than when high-wage workers receive a pay increase. When someone with a lot of money gets a pay increase, they may choose to invest it, they may choose to go on a nice international vacation, lots of different things they can be doing with that money. But when low-wage workers receive a pay increase, they're more likely to spend that money in local businesses and treat themselves to things like a haircut or an evening out, and that helps strengthen that local economy, bolstering local communities as well. So paying a living wage, it's good for employers, it's good for businesses, and it's good for communities. And if there's anyone who's watching this and is interested in becoming a living wage employer, we try and make the process as easy as possible. So first of all, work out how many of your staff are not earning a living wage. And the wage amount takes into account any non-mandatory benefits that you offer. So if you offer full 100% employer paid health and dental, that lowers your living wage requirements by about $1.50, because it means that the workers don't have to take out their own private healthcare plan. We have a calculator on our website that can be used to work out the value of those benefits. So if you're interested, go and have a look at that. Then develop a plan to bring those workers up to the living wage and put plans in place to ensure that all contractors, for example, cleaners, are earning a living wage on signing of new contracts. And then the final step is to apply it on our website, and there's a simple application form that you can complete. And then the fourth step that's not listed is to promote it and to tell the world that you're a living wage employer. This is Kokoro, who are a dance studio in the downtown east side, and they're really proud about the fact they're a living wage employer. And we found that when one employer talks about it, suddenly all of their competitors and other organizations in their sector are really interested and join us too. So we had a window cleaning company in Surrey that became a living wage employer, and suddenly we had one, after they were telling all of their customers and they were telling the world about it, we suddenly had another 5 applications from other window cleaning companies in Surrey. So hopefully your organization can have a similar impact in the local community and on your team. And that's it from me and Iglika in terms of the formal presentation. Over to Amanda to kind of host the Q&A for us. We've seen lots of questions coming in.
Wonderful. First of all, thank you, Iglika and Anastasia, for that great presentation and walkthrough. Yes, we've had a very lively chat, as always, which is great. Great to see folks engaging. And a few questions have come in through the chat and Q&A. So we'll get through as many as we can in the next, 15, 17 minutes. First off, I'll probably flip back to Iglika a little bit, a few questions around kind of the calculations of the numbers. First, we just had a question that if you can just confirm, how many working hours per week is the living wage calculation actually based on?
The living wage calculation is based on 35 hours a week. And for the two-parent family with 2 children, so both parents working 35 hours a week. Yeah.
All right. And related, I know there's numerous kind of households or family types that you could obviously break this down for. So, one working full-time, one parent working part-time, that sort of thing. We are seeing potentially a growing number of particularly young people that are couples that aren't having children. So there's been a few requests if there was any consideration at looking at a calculation for childless couples, or why that was not selected as one of the households to look at.
Yeah, childless couples would obviously have lower living wages because they would earn as much as the couple with children, but would have much lower costs. And so the reason why we're not calculating this, so obviously the living wage is sufficient for families that are just couples without children. The reason why we're not calculating it for them is that we want to produce a living wage calculation that allows for people to have children if they so choose. If we were benchmarking against the lower wage, then nobody would ever be able to afford to have children on this wage. And that's important for us. There is a lot of evidence out there that the reason why birth rates are declining in developed countries, including in Canada, is affordability, and especially housing, is that families just cannot afford to have children because they can't afford the housing that is necessary to accommodate children. So that is why it is very important to us to still allow for the cost of having children, and this wage be a decent wage that does not prevent people from having children on economic grounds.
I'd also add the changes we made this year reflect the living wage calculations in Ontario and Alberta, and they use those 3 family types. So as much as possible, we try and be as consistent with other places across the province. So if someone is looking at a map, they know that they're kind of comparing apples to apples. The UK use something like 16 or 20 different family types to calculate their living wage. I don't think we have the resources to do that. Certainly no time soon. But who knows in the future? But at the moment, we also want to be as consistent as we can with other places too.
Thank you both. Iglika, one more for you, particularly when kind of talking about wages and wage gaps. You know, we know obviously the gap between minimum wage and living wage, but a few questions around how do you get information about what wages currently are, whether they are minimum or living wage, and is that information publicly available? Can anyone access that?
You mean what wages people get paid actually in the labor market?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so the information, so the Statistics Canada does a labor market survey every month. It's called the Labor Force Survey, and produces data on you would have seen the number of jobs created or lost every month and the unemployment rate. They also collect data on wages. And so it is not all publicly available. I think you can get the average and medians, and you can probably get, it broken down by unionization status or some other demographic variables. But the numbers we used for the report that Anna was referencing on how many people earn less than the living wage, we had to purchase it from Statistics Canada. It is data you can buy, but it comes from the Labor Force Survey, and it is not otherwise publicly available if you don't pay for it. So we paid for it, and we think Statistics Canada should do more with the data they collect on wages beyond publishing just the average and the median wage in the province. And so they do tell us that the more people that buy it, it shows them that people care about that stuff and they consider making it public. So hopefully, if we buy it a few more times, they will consider making it public. But it is technically, it should be public because it is collected by Statistics Canada, but it is not. The other information on wages that people would be interested in that's also available through Statistics Canada is they produce average wages for vacancies for like the jobs that are out there, and that comes from it doesn't come from a survey, it comes from administrative data that's collected directly from businesses that have job openings. And so you can see the average wages for the jobs being offered on the market by occupation or by sector. And so it's really interesting to see often that the jobs that have the most vacancies often also have the lowest average wages. And there's many job vacancies that are advertised at average wages significantly below the living wage in Metro Vancouver.
Thank you. Um, I have this question might be more for Anastasia. It's a little bit more from the employer end of things. Many organizations use cost of labor instead of cost of living for their base salary calculations. It's reflective of how much hiring for a specific role will cost and kind of their own internal calculations. How might you suggest that employers can reconcile this approach with also wanting to be a living wage employer as they're two different concepts? I know that's a really big question. Take your time.
Yeah, I mean, the living wage kind of our ethos comes from regardless whatever the job you're doing, you should be earning enough to pay for rent and pay for food. And the challenge we have right now is that because the living wage is so high, because of the affordability crisis, particularly housing and food, has pushed up that living wage, it makes it a lot harder for employers to pay their workers a living wage. And so that's why we're advocating really hard at government on how we can lower the cost of housing. How can we lower the cost of food? How can we bring down costs so actually it makes it easier for employers to pay their workers a living wage, as well as talking about the benefits of paying a living wage and the impact it has both on business and on workers. But one thing we do when we're talking to employers who are interested, but they're looking and they're like, oh, I only pay my staff $23, $24 an hour. I really want to be a living wage employer, but I'm not there yet. To do that breakdown, to look at how much the benefits that you offer are, because once you've done that and we've got a calculator on our website that can be completed, suddenly that challenge looks a bit easier. And so actually, if you're offering an additional 10 days vacation or additional sick pay or additional health and dental or additional training for your staff, whatever you're doing to kind of invest in your workforce, it lowers that living wage, which makes it easier to pay a living wage.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm looking at time and also scrolling through questions, so trying to be strategic here. Um, I have a question. Again, I'll pitch this to Anastasia. How is living wage certification handled for an organization that employs someone whose wage is set by an external funder or grant or third party if that wage is below living wage? This is a great question. As someone who's worked in nonprofits in particular, I have come up against this numerous times.
Yeah, it's really tough for nonprofits right now. I speak with nonprofit leaders, and the challenge they have with paying a living wage isn't convincing them that it's the right thing to do, but that their funding just doesn't quite keep up with it. And that's why we partnered with BC Policy Solutions, Poverty Reduction Coalition, and many others to try and advocate with funders that actually they need to be ensuring that when they're funding organizations, they're funding it at a rate that pays a living wage. And there are some funders out there that do that. Vancouver Foundation, make sure any of the funding that they give can pay a living wage. United Way do the same thing. The big funder that would make the biggest difference is the BC government. And if we can get the province to become a living wage employer and to make sure that any grants that they're giving and any contracts they have with nonprofits pays a living wage, that could help hundreds, if not thousands, of nonprofits across the province pay a living wage. In the meantime, I encourage nonprofit leaders whose funding doesn't quite keep up with it to reach out to us to see what advocacy we can do together. I've written this year to Ministry of Education and Childcare because there are many, and this links in with another question about childcare workers not being paid enough, where often the funding that they get from the government doesn't keep up with the living wage. And we're trying to advocate to change that. Fingers crossed we can get some traction, but it's really difficult right now for a lot of nonprofits.
Thank you, and thank you for your transparency on that. Also, a couple questions around, I was just looking at it and I lost it. Give me a minute. I guess this might be back to Iglika again. Any exploration of what adjustments might need to be made to the living wage for a disabled or chronically ill person and how that might factor into how you make your calculations?
Thank you, Amanda. That's a great question. Thanks to whoever asked it. It is very important and something I did not mention in the webinar that obviously this does not take into account the costs of having a disability. We don't have the resources to make estimates for people with disabilities. It's very complicated due to, obviously the fact that every disability is different and the kind of costs that are related are different. It is clear, though, that costs would be higher and possibly the capacity to work would not be necessarily full time. And so adjustments would need to be made. I think yeah, but there is a push right now to get the more Statistics Canada in their market basket measure or official measure of poverty to take into account extra costs of disability and also critiques that it doesn't cover the extra costs for seniors who are, have, often have disabilities, not all of them, but also have other challenges and higher healthcare costs that are not necessarily captured in the market basket measure. And also with disability, a lot of the costs that you don't necessarily think about, but housing needs to be accessible or, can't be just any low rent apartment. It has to be in particular area. So a lot of extra costs and we recognize that this is the living wage for kind of the average non-disabled worker.
And the other thing we've heard actually loudly and clearly from our community partners outside of Metro Vancouver is that the calculation doesn't include the cost of medical travel. So if you're living in a rural or remote community and you need to visit a doctor or the hospital for whatever reason, or you're pregnant and you need to give birth, there's a lot of additional costs there in terms of being able to travel to the nearest big city for the cost of kind of staying in hotels or those kind of travel costs. The BC government offers some travel support, but it's not enough and doesn't include that. So it's something we've heard. I don't know if we can necessarily factor it into the calculations, or we need to be more transparent that these are costs that aren't included. And so if you have a disability or you have a chronic health thing, actually your needs and costs are even higher. And the other thing that slightly is tied in is that I also speak with employers who hire, who have staff who receive disability benefits, and they have to look really closely at how many hours those workers can work so that they don't get their disability benefits clawed back. And as Iglika highlighted, having a disability costs you money. And so it shouldn't be money you're receiving on disability shouldn't be getting in the way of wages that you should be earning. And it should be that a disabled worker or someone receiving disability assistance should be entitled to the same number of hours and pay that a non-disabled worker has, rather than being worried that that money is going to get clawed back. And at the same time, you lose access to other kind of benefits as well.
Mm. Lots of interconnected factors that make it complicated. I am aware of time, so I'm going to leave us with one final question, perhaps for both of you. Seems to be questions that come up regularly in our webinars, basically around what can we do? Most folks here obviously support this a lot. I've seen a question, Anastasia, how can I as an employee encourage or get my employer to sign up as a living wage employer? And also, Iglika, I know you mentioned kind of the call to action as well, so maybe I'll just pass it back to both of you to kind of tackle what folks can do following up from this.
I'll do the worker one and then you can do government. So we have some resources that we put on our website to help people advocate for a living wage. It can be a difficult and delicate conversation to have within your workplace. If you're unionized, that's easier because there's power and solidarity to be fighting for better wages. If you're not unionized, there's always the risk that you might be stirring up the pot or things like that. So we want to help as much as we can. We're happy to go into workplaces and give presentations about the benefits of being a living wage employer. And we're also happy to put different living wage employers in touch with others. So if there's a municipality that's interested, but they can't quite work out how this thing works or this payroll thing would work, we can connect different HR experts with each other to talk through how they've done that, from kind of payroll expert to payroll expert. Can also be ways to make it work. But we have some resources on our website. If you visit livingwagebc.ca/workers, there are some tools there from some data that can be kind of taken to help advocate for living wage within your workplace.
Yeah, and the other thing you can do that is very powerful is to talk to more people about the living wage. I think a lot of people have heard about the living wage, but not everyone. And so it's super important to spread the word, to share the report or your community fact sheet. We have two-pager for every community. There's a two-pager for Metro Vancouver too, if you want a more easy entrance to it than the big report. But talking to your neighbors, talking to your friends, many of your friends, some of your friends might be employers or might be in a position to be, close to employers and to be able to become a living wage employer. But also there's a huge potential in advocating for policy change in government. We have on our website, and I think maybe my colleague can post the link here of the Take Action item. There is a letter writing tool to write an email to David Eby and your MLA and send them the local two-pager. I highly recommend that. There's also opportunity for you to get involved with the municipal election that's coming up next year. It is hugely important for municipalities to be living wage employers. They are anchor employers in communities. Often a lot of contractors, benchmark against them. And so if you can ask, if you are maybe considering running for municipal government, or if you ask all the people who are running for municipal government to make commitments for living wage, I think this is really important. And the Metro Vancouver, well, the city of Vancouver used to be a living wage employer until a few years ago, and unfortunately, our mayor and council decided they no longer wish to ensure that all workers get a decent wage to, afford living in this expensive region. And now they pay the average of the last 5 years of the living wage, I think, which, it would be fun if we could all pay the average of our last 5 years of rent prices or food prices, but that's not how it works. So, we need to put more pressure on the city of Vancouver to become a living wage employer again as well.
Wonderful. Thank you both again, not just for being here today and sharing, but for all of the work that goes into this, calculations in the report. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. My colleague has shared in the chat lots of links where you can find more information about both organizations. So please give us and Living Wage BC a follow on socials if you do not already. We'd love to engage further with you. I also just want to acknowledge there were a number of questions in the chat and in the Q&A just around different breakdowns of, for Metro Vancouver or different regions in the province. We are collecting all of those. We will make sure that that Iglika and Anastasia has that to take into consideration as we take in like future things. So we didn't get into all the nuanced breakdowns of those today. But thank you again for joining us and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. And if anyone does have any questions, our email addresses are on the website, so you can get in touch and we can get in touch with you privately to answer any questions people have. Thank you for hosting.
Perfect. Thank you.